Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, Jaya Kodanitai, Maya Pusashi, Kodanitai, Jaya Maya Pusashi, Jaya Kodanitai, Maya Pusashi, Jaya Kodanitai, Jaya Maya Pusashi, Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Prabhupada. Haridas Thakur ki jai, Sekahoshi Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda, Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda ki jai, Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Vrindavan ki jai, Maya Point Navadvip Dham ki jai, Ganga Maya ki jai, Jamuna Maya ki jai, Tulsi Devi ki jai, Bhakti Devi ki jai, Nitai Gaura Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the lotus feet of Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. All glories to Shri Prabhupada. Hare Krishna, everyone. So I can only imagine everyone must be getting very bored of seeing me sitting here and listening. Also, I'm feeling a little alone up here today. So I've got my better half, so you're left with the worse half. So hopefully you all will tolerate. So we've chosen another specific verse today from a different section of the Bhagavatam. If you can set up on the board 4219. That's it. Some discussion on this section of the Bhagavatam. Before we begin, I would first like to seek blessings on all the assembled Vaishnavas that we see fit to bestow your mercy upon me so that I can speak something relevant and bona fide from the pages of this most exalted scripture, the Srimad Bhagavatam. Only by the mercy of Vaishnavas is anything possible, so I am therefore seeking your blessings. So before we begin, we can chant the invocation. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Nishidyamana Sadasya Mukya Daksho Garitraya Vishvijya Shapam Tasmad Vinishkramya Vivridamanyor Jagamakoravya Nijam Niketanam Nishidyamana Sasadasya Mukya Daksho Giritraya Visvijya Shapam Tasmad Vinishkramya Vividamanyor Jagamakoravya Nijam Niketanam Nishidyamana Sasadasya Mukya Daksho Giritraya Visvijya Shapam Tasmad Vinishkramya Vivridamanyor Jagamakoravya Nijam Niketanam Nishidyamana Sadasya Mukya Daksho Giritraya Visvijya Shapam Tasmad Vinishkramya Vividamanyor Jagamakoravya Sadasya Mukyaye Namakobhavya Nijam Niketanam. Word for word translation. Nishidyamana, being requested not to. Saha, he, Daksha. Sadasya Mukyaye, by the members of the sacrifice. Daksha, Daksha. Giritraya, to Shiva. Vishrija, giving. Shapam, a curse. Tasmat, from that place. Vinishkramya, going out. Vivridamanyuhu, being exceedingly angry. Jagama, went. Kodapya, O Vidura. Nijam, to his own. Niketanam, home. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Maitreya continued, my dear Vidura, in spite of the requests of all the members of the sacrificial assembly, Daksha, in great anger, cursed Lord Shiva, and then left the assembly and went back to his home. Anger is so detrimental that even a great personality like Daksha, out of anger, left the arena where Brahma was presiding, and all the great sages and pious and saintly persons were assembled. All of them requested him not to leave, but infuriated, he left, thinking that the auspicious place was not fit for him. Puffed up by his exalted position, he thought that no one was greater than he in argument. It appears that all the members of the assembly, including Lord Brahma, requested him not to be angry and leave their company. But in spite of all these requests, he left. That is the effect of cruel anger. In Bhagavad Gita, therefore, it is advised that one who desires to make tangible advancement in spiritual consciousness must avoid three things: lust, anger, mode of passion. Actually, we can see that lust, anger, and passion make a man crazy, even though he be as great as Daksha. The very name Daksha suggests that he was expert in all material activities, but still, because of his aversion towards such a saintly person as Shiva, he was attacked by these three enemies: anger, lust, and passion. Lord Chaitanya therefore advised that one be very careful not to offend Vaishnavas. He compared offenses toward a Vaishnava to a mad elephant. As a mad elephant can do anything horrible, so when a person offends a Vaishnava, he can perform any abominable action. Jai Shri Prabhupada Ki Jai. Om ज्ञानतिमिरन्दस्य ज्ञानञ्जना शलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः। श्रीचैतन्यमनोभीष्टं स्थापितं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपा कदा मह्यं ददाति स्वपदान्तिकम्। वन्देऽहं श्रीगुरून् श्रीयुतपदकमलं श्रीगुरून् वैष्णवंश्च श्रीरूपं साग्रजातं सहना रघुनाथान्वितं तं सजीवं साद्वैतं सावधूतं परिजनसहितं कृष्णचैतन्यदेवं श्रीराधा कृष्णपदं सहगना ललिता श्रीविशाखान्वितंश्च। हे कृष्ण करुणा सिन्धु दीनबन्धु जगत्पते गोपीशा गोपिका कान्त राधाकान्त नमोऽस्तुते। तप्त कंचन गौराङ्गे राधे वृन्दावनेश्वरी वृषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये। पञ्चकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपासिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः। श्रीकृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानन्द श्री अद्वैता गदाधर शिवासादि गौरभक्तवृन्द। हरे कृष्णा कृष्ण कृष्ण हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे। Nishijimana sasadasya mukyar daksho giritaya vishrijya shapam tasmad vinishkramya vivridamanu agama korabhya nijam niketana. Maitreya continued, my dear Vidura, in spite of the requests of all the members of the sacrificial assembly, Daksha, in great anger, cursed Lord Shiva and then left the assembly and went back to his home. So, anyone who's not familiar with this pastime, anyone who is familiar, everyone's familiar then because nobody reads me to say they're not. So, at Hokusijapur, would you like to bring us up to speed? What's happening here? What's going on in this pastime? Yeah, something like that. Very nice, yes. So, over the last few days, we've been discussing different pastimes in the Bhagavatam, and also different discussions with devotees in the community, and meeting with the leaders. And at least in our discussions in the morning, we had the first day, and anyone remembers what we discussed on the first day? That was 2 days ago, yes. Can't care, yeah. So remember the acronym. What was the pastime? I think that's good. I'm not sure. Yes, what was the pastime? That's right. The four Kumaras arriving at the gates of Vaikuntha and cursing Jai and Vijay because they stopped them from entry. Yes. And the acronym was CARE. We're not going to ask you to remember the bits and pieces. Does anyone remember? No? We kind of remember what each letter stood for? Yeah, okay. Should I test you? What is C? A, appearance of the Lord. R, responsibility. And E, expert leadership. Wow, okay, very powerful. Acronyms are good for learning. Yeah? So, in this pastime, there was offense, there was upset, there was disagreement, but somehow the Lord manifested and he kind of resolved it. And in the end, even though there was rectification, but everybody seemed to become humbled in the situation and accept responsibility. Everyone accepted responsibility, including the Supreme Lord. So he took full responsibility. And then yesterday we discussed another pastime. Anyone remembers the acronym? Yes, we're going to live forever. So fame, yes. And F stood for forgiveness. A for acceptance. M for making adjustments. And E, empowered. No, I think it was envy, right? Yeah, it was envy. Yeah, and what was the pastime? Ritu Maharaj and Lord Indra. Yes, so there was again a disagreement between these two great personalities. And once again, the Lord ultimately manifested. People got involved, seniors got involved, and was able to rectify the situation. So, and without, in both instances, in one sense you could say it was with little disruption to the whole community, although you could say Indra was disrupting things and disturbed some minds, but it was relatively low impact. Today, we're looking at a very high impact situation that if things are not dealt with properly, can completely dismantle community, can completely divide people. We see in society that we're living in now, I think especially for me over the last 5 years, I just see perpetual divide in not only in ISKCON community but in the world, starting with Brexit. That was like a divide amongst the United Kingdom. Actually, it didn't start with Brexit. It started with Trump becoming the president. I remember I was in England when that happened and was watching, and I just saw right down the middle, wasn't it? It was one of those splits, 49 to 51 kind of thing, It was like, wow, division right down the middle, It wasn't a landslide type of thing. Then we wound up going to America, and I was in America when the Brexit vote happened. That was another right down the middle split, And you just see that there's a lot of polarization going on. People are having to choose sides on massive and major decisions. In our own movement, similar types of things are happening. Big decisions having to be made about things and polarization right down the middle. So these things can happen. So what's happened here, now I do have an acronym for this, but I wasn't going to use it because I thought maybe the devotees are getting sick of hearing these acronyms and they think it's just like some little trendy, catchy thing. So I'll leave it up to you. Do you want to hear the acronym? Yeah, it seems like everyone remembers the others, so okay, so it's useful. So the acronym for this pastime is, let's see if I can see, fear. Why fear? Because Aksha was fearful of loss of prestige. Later in the pastime, Lord Shiva is fearful of what's going to happen to his wife, Sati, if she goes to the house of her father. And in the purport, Srila Prabhupada begins to stress on the fact that we should be fearful of offending Vaishnava. So the acronym for this pastime is so F. F stands for false ego. Anyone here has heard of the false ego? Who knows the same? Anyone here used to have a false ego? Anyone used to have a false ego? It's so long ago, it's hard to remember if we ever had one, right? Anyone here still finds from time to time the false ego mixes in metals in our lives? Yes, usually making a bit of a mess of things. So, false ego, ahankara, yeah, ahankara, mudatma, kartahamiti manyate. We think because of this false ego, we're thinking that we are the body, yeah. But in that verse, kartahamiti manyate, huh? That's right. We think we are the doers of activity. We think that the buck stops with us, and it's all because of me, because of my greatness. Of course, if something does lives, we don't take credit for that. That certainly gets blamed on somebody else, right? But if things go well around us, then who's really the ultimate source of all auspiciousness? Well, it's me, of course, in case you hadn't noticed. So like that, this is the tendency of the false ego, to push blame onto others so that we still look good. And if there's something that happens that makes us look good, then we take the credit for it. This is the nature of the false ego. It is always perpetually trying to protect our identity. But what is that identity? It's not our true identity, it is our false identity. Ego means id, or identity. Srila Prabhupada explained that there's a false ego, and then there is a true ego. There is actually a true identity, and that's what separates us as Gaudiya Vaishnavas from impersonalists, because we believe that there ultimately is a true identity also. And that identity is Jiva Swarupo Krishna Nichadas, that we are the eternal servants of Krishna. But unfortunately, as we know, coming into the material world, we become covered by avidya, means that our knowledge is covered by avidya, means ignorance. And that ignorance is in the form of a false impression. So it's like, here we are, the little jiva, and we come into the material world, and we get covered over, and then we pretend, we think that we are that person. And so we live our lives thinking that we're this body, and perpetually convinced and trying to convince others that we're also this body. So Daksha, he enters. Now this is really, I find this pastime very powerful. And my wife also finds this pastime very powerful, mainly because she's kind of, she sometimes likes to see that, people do the wrong thing. She has a little bit of Kshatriya nature, but they get what they deserve, And for her, this is a bit of a, I guess you could say, a moment where, Shiva plucks the hair and creates the demon who goes into the assembly hall and just wreaks havoc on all the people who have committed an offense. Now, I don't think this is her truest and deepest nature, but sometimes, because of our conditioned nature, let's be honest. Who here likes to see somebody who deserves something kind of get what they deserve? If we're really honest, we may not say it out loud, but if someone does something to us and then they trip or stub their toe, or we think, just see. I remember once someone did something to me and they turned around and I think they bumped into the wall and I just went, ha, instant karma.
And I thought, oh God, where did that come from? You know, it's so nasty. That's some really nasty stuff. Like I actually was happy that that person bumped into the wall. You know, so this is the nature of false pride. So Daksha, he enters the assembly, and it's described that when he entered the assembly, he was effulgent, almost more. I think it describes he was more effulgent than anyone else in the room. He was just such an elevated person. And he entered, and he was the conductor of the yajna. He's a Prajapati, so he's, a very, very exalted person, holds a very high position. All of these demigods have assembled. Lord Brahma is there, Shiva is there. I mean, he's a very, very exalted personality. And when he enters, there's so much respect and appreciation. Everyone stands up for him, and everyone is showing him, Daksha's, he's he's the man, he is the man. And with all of that, again, you can see with all of these pastimes, especially with Prithu Maharaj's pastime and Indra's pastime, both of them had so much opulence. What was the need for them to worry about such a small thing? And Daksha enters, and he sees that Shiva doesn't stand up. And immediately he feels slighted and disrespected. And what does it say in Bhagavad Gita about an honorable man and disrespect? That's right. The dishonor or disrespect for someone who has been honored, it's worse than death. And we know in the pastime later of Ashwatthama, they also, instead of killing him, they kind of disrespect him by cutting the jewel in his head, and they say that's just as good as killing him because he's been disrespected. So Daksha feels slighted. Now, for me, there's so many things that could have happened at this time. Daksha could have just thought, okay, anyway, that wasn't so cool. Shiva, you probably should have stood up. You're my son-in-law. I know you're Shiva, but there's also a relationship there where you're kind of, because there are many different types of relationships. There's a relationship there where you could have, where you're subordinate to me. I'm your father-in-law. I'm also the kind of judgment of the assembly. So at least you should have stood up. But, and he could have completely kept his cool and just carried on with the program and maybe had a quiet word in the ear of Shiva later, or spoken to someone who could have spoken to Shiva. This is the thing we were talking about, making adjustments and taking responsibility and not being just cause and response, cause and reaction, that we find space to enter. But what happened is Daksha was offended, and immediately what erupted from his heart? Anger. And Srila Prabhupada focuses on that in the purport, and we'll come to that in a moment. So, and then Daksha couldn't help himself. So he welcomes everyone, and then he says, thank you all very much for coming, but there is one person in this assembly. Now you can imagine an assembly of all these great personalities, and he singles out Lord Shiva, and he says he was basically just a disrespectful wretch. Doesn't even know how to show respect. He associates with low quality people, spends his time in crematoriums and graveyards, and somehow he's married to my daughter, who is beautiful. His eyes are like the eyes of a monkey, and he's married to my daughter, who has doe-like eyes. I didn't even want him to marry her, but Lord Brahma, maybe, so then all of a sudden he slights Lord Brahma, indirectly, criticizing Lord Brahma. He forced me to accept him as my son-in-law. And this is what happens, right? With pride, we can't control ourselves, you know. Once we get on a roll, we're like, I'm going to let him have it, every last bit of it, and I'm not going to stop until I'm done. And of course, in this in this verse, it explains that Daksha, all the assembly, the exalted persons were encouraging Daksha, don't offend Shiva. And after he offended them, he said, don't leave the assembly. Let's try to rectify and sort this out. But what did he do? He launched his attack, and then he said, and just walked out and left. Went home, feeling fully justified, feeling fully righteous in what he just did. Why? Because he's the man. I am the man. I am the center. So this is false ego. This is pride. So then we move on to E. And this false ego is very prone to experience E, which is, we've discussed it already, envy. Envy. So you can see in this pastime that Daksha was actually envious of Shiva. Now, Shiva not standing up, because this is also another pastime where you could debate. I mean, why didn't Shiva just stand up? Later, this conversation between Dakshayani, the daughter of Daksha, Parvati. Today is also, at least in the Vaishnava calendar that I have today, is also Durga Puja Day. So we don't usually celebrate Durga Puja, but we have great respect for Durga Devi, the wife of Lord Shiva, the controller of the material world. So it's good that we speak about her and mention her today on this auspicious day. So, later in conversation, I lost my train of thought. What's that?
Dakshayani speaks with Daksha. So
That's where he's feeling justified.
Yeah, he was feeling justified. Anyway, later, later Sati, she's speaking with her father. And yeah, he's so proud. He has so much envy. And, oh no, she was speaking with Shiva, that's it. Why didn't Shiva just stand up? Why didn't Shiva just stand up? And she's speaking with him, and he says, well, I was in trance. She said, you're in trance. Remembering Vishnu, but how are you in trance remembering Vishnu in the middle of such an august assembly and such an important time? And he says, it's not up to me when the Lord wants to invoke his presence in my heart. What am I supposed to do? Tell him to go away when I feel like overwhelmed in trance? And if you think about it, of course, Lord Shiva is quite a interesting character in the Bhagavatam, and personality, not character in a derogatory sense, but because, of course, we know in the society we live in, Lord Shiva is often worshipped by different types of personalities, and he's controller of the mode of ignorance. But he's also known as Vaishnavanam Yata Shambhu. He is known as the greatest of Vaishnavas. And he's always absorbed in remembering the Lord and chanting the Lord's holy name. He's so powerful that when Ganga Devi descends into the material, into this universe, into this world, he's the personality who's able to receive her and break her fall into the material world. He's actually not, as Brahma Samhita explains, he's not different from Krishna in one sense. But he's like yogurt or curd, and Krishna is like milk. He also has his own tattva. He has his own tattva that's very difficult for us to understand. He's his own unique personality, and he has a supreme eternal form also, Sadashiva. So he's very, and if you ever go to the Dham, what are you supposed to do before entering the Dham? You're meant to take shelter of? Yeah. say it again, Kshetrapa. Yes, you take shelter of Kshetrapa, of Lord Shiva, and he allows you entrance. So Lord Shiva is an exalted personality. And in this situation, we can understand really, he could have shown respect, but for whatever reason, he didn't. And sometimes there are situations where there are exalted personalities who are transcendental to the customs and rules and regulations. And we have to be very careful that we don't confuse them with, a new bhakta or bhakti who just moved into the ashram and maybe doesn't know any of the rules or customs. But someone who's very exalted and transcendental to the material energy, they're not actually obliged to follow the rules and regulations. But Daksha's envy of this personality caused him to become, which is the next letter, which is A. And what did he become? Angry. Now it's interesting in this purport, I didn't get into it so much, but Srila Prabhupada mentions in Bhagavad Gita there are 3 things that are described that we should avoid. And we all know what they are. What are they? Without looking at the purport?
Lust, anger, and the greed mode of passion.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if I've heard many times where Prabhupada says mode of passion instead of greed. Did anyone else experience? When I first read this, I was like, oh, isn't that interesting? And then, not only did he say it the first time, but he made sure that every time in the purport he referred to that. So I wanted to look it up, but I didn't get the chance to look that up specifically. And see if that's coming from one of the commentaries of one of the previous acharyas that they specifically point that out. Of course, we know greed is certainly influenced by the mode of passion. So in one sense, yeah, it's synonymous. But all of those characteristics, lust is also influenced by the mode of passion. Anger is, I guess you could say, mode of passion degrading into ignorance. And then greed is there. So Srila Prabhupada really hones in on this tendency of anger. And I'm sure none of you have ever experienced, but anyone here has ever seen anyone get angry? Yes? Anyone here has ever been a little angry? Yeah, a few. Okay, yeah. That's what happens among saintly stuff. Anger doesn't anger. We heard about that. People still do that. It's like smoking, right? People still smoke. When I see someone smoking a cigarette, I think, God, do people still do that? It's like, really? God, it's so disgusting. People actually really still do light something on fire and stick it in their face. I mean, isn't that bizarre? So, yeah, anger. And how powerful is anger? And where does anger come from? From? Frustration. Specifically, Yayato Vishyapam Samsangaste. Yayato Vishyapam Samsangat. Yayato Vishyapam Samsangas. Yeah, that's amazing. Yayato Vishyapam Samsangas Sanjayate Kama Kama Koto Vijayate. No, I skipped one, didn't I? Yayato Vishyapam Sangas Sanjaya. No.
Sangasteshu pajayate.
Sangasteshu Vijayate.
Sangat sanjayate kama. Kama krodha vijayate.
Yes. Still can get it. Used to just roll off the tongue. But anyway, from that means from the development of attachment within the mind. What develops? Kama, lust. And from lust comes anger. Because of frustration. Because we can't really enjoy. We lust after something, and when we get it, we think we're happy, but how long does the enjoyment last with it? Oh, I got a new microphone, and then someone drops it on the floor. Anger. You get a new car, and someone scratches it, or it breaks down. Anger. You get the person of your dreams, and then they leave you. Anger. So we're always lusting after something, but then it leads ultimately to anger and frustration. So Srila Prabhupada explains in the purport How powerful. Anger is so detrimental that even a great personality like Daksha, out of anger, left the arena, even though they all were requesting him. But he couldn't hear. This is another important point. When we become angry, it's very difficult to hear anything, because the false ego becomes so big. I often use this example that the false ego inside, and in the purport it mentions being puffed up. So the false ego puffs up. And the membrane of the false ego covers these two holes on the side of our head. So nothing can pierce through it. It just hits it, whoop, and bounces off. People say, oh, it's not the best thing to do like that. Can't hear anything.
Mm-hmm.
The false ego is puffed up. And then what does it take? It takes someone coming along with a needle, right? A pen. And then all of a sudden, oh, why didn't I listen? Why didn't I hear? Why didn't I pay attention? Why didn't I think about, Anyone has that experience? So it takes, if we can't be humble, we can't exhibit humility, then we have to be humiliated. And then from humiliation, we become a little humble. And then all these things happen. But we'll come to that also, but we're running out of time. So yes, when we're angry, we can't hear. We become blinded. In that verse, it leads from anger, from kama to krodha, and then we become bewildered, forgetful, bewilderment of memory, loss of intelligence, and then we fall down into the material pool. So anger is one of the gates to hell, and Srila Prabhupada in the purport is very, very much stressing that we have to be careful. Anyway, many things to say on that. And the last letter, so we had, what's the acronym?
Fear,
F,
false ego,
E,
envy,
A,
anger,
and R. What do you think R stands for?
Retribution.
Oh, almost. Yes, when you get angry, you want revenge. And that's exactly what Daksha wants. And then when a great personality is offended, we could say in this room, great, someone says something to it, Hoksajapuru, you have eyes like a monkey, And then whoever's in the room who's like, no, Hoksaja's my friend. Then they'll like, how dare you speak to a Hoksajapuru like that? And then someone who's my friend, they say, no, he deserves it, and then it becomes this whole divide, and then that's what happened on the scene. Cursing, counter-cursing, Nandi, first thing Nandi says is, how dare you speak like that? And Brahmins, you're sitting there listening, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And then someone else curses, and then it just goes on and on. The next thing you know, it's just like a curse fest, like you have Sunday Krishna Fest. Show up at the temple, festival of colors. It's a festival of curses. Here we go. Who can curse some of the worst? And it becomes detrimental. And so ultimately, with this revenge, Daksha wants or everyone in the community, they all want their retribution. They want their revenge. Shiva stops associating with Daksha, but his wife is the daughter of Daksha. And then Daksha's having another big sacrifice. All the demigods and all the great personalities are showing up, and she doesn't realize what's actually happened in that assembly. And because Shiva just said, oh, me and your father just had a disagreement. Sometimes the husband will not fill the wife in on all the gory details, but there was just a little episode. It wasn't so nice. But she's desiring to go to the house of her father. Lord Shiva's like, no, it's probably better you don't go. It's not gonna turn out well for you or us if you do go. And then, but she's like, you've never refused me anything. Why are you doing this now? What did you do to my father? So all of a sudden, she was getting the grief at home. It's like, this Daksha guy, he's really getting on my nerves now. But he's like, no, I didn't do anything to your father. I have no animosity towards him whatsoever. I'm equipoised towards all living entities, in fact. But he became upset with me. And then he starts to explain the story. And she said, well, why didn't you stand up? And that's when he says, I was in trance. What was I supposed to do? I wasn't able to stand up at that time. And then she said, oh, anyway, I want to go. And so she went, and all the followers again went. And Daksha just completely blanks her. Just completely blanks her. Most everyone is blanking her at the assembly because they know Daksha's angry with her and Shiva's not welcome. And then she's sitting there, and her sisters and mother, they're like, oh, Sati, you're here. We'll get Daksha, he'll come. And Daksha just kind of looks and then turns his head away. So she feels slighted. And now we know, hell hath no fury, right? Like the scorn of a woman. And so she's sitting there fuming. And Daksha goes on with the yajna, and the Brahmins are chanting, and then she hears that they leave out Lord Shiva's name. And she's like, this is just blasphemy. This is complete Vaishnava aparad, and I cannot tolerate this. And then she wants her revenge. And she stands up and she begins slighting her father in front of everyone. You're just, the only thing you're expert at is sense gratification. You're just performing these big yajnas so you can enjoy your senses. Whereas my husband, he's renounced. Yet you have the audacity to curse him in front of her. And she just lays into him, and he's just like, dismissive of her. So she gets I think an orange chudder and an achman cup, and she sits in the middle of the room and she says, my husband sometimes calls me Dakshyani because I'm your daughter, because you gave me this body. I don't even want this body anymore because it has connection with you. So therefore, I'm going to give up this body. And then she performs what becomes known as sati, where she basically invokes the fire from within her body and merges into that fire and just bursts into the flames, in the middle of this. I mean, this is pretty extreme stuff, when people get angry, when people start lighting themselves on fire in the middle of the sacrificial arena. It's gotten out of hand. Somebody should just get on the floor and say, I can't believe I let this go this far, How could it have gotten to this point? I am really sorry. Will someone please forgive me? Whatever rectification I need, I'll take it. Please, just don't light yourself on fire. But he was so proud and so full of envy that he couldn't do it. And he just allowed her to do it. And then that was the beginning of another crazy mess. Because then Lord Shiva's, servants who accompanied Sati, they just went ballistic. And then it was like cursing, counter-cursing again, fighting, and all madness. And then they went back to Lord Shiva, and Lord Shiva, then he had to have his revenge. And so he just plucked the hair from his head and invoked this monster, this demon. What was the demon's name? Anyone remembers? It's like, wasn't Brickasaur? Was it Brickasaur? No. Anyway, I can't remember his name. Oh no, what was it? It was, what's the boy that lives in Kent? Virabhadra, that was the name. That was the name of the demon. Virabhadra. I was always wondering why he got the name Virabhadra. So Virabhadra, and he said Virabhadra just, pooh, that was it, he just wrecked the whole scene. Anyway, this pastime goes on for, I think, like 5 or 6 chapters in the beginning of the Bhagavatam, before finally everyone goes to Lord Shiva, who's just chilling out in Kailash, sitting under the tree, chanting the names of the Lord. And they all have to go there with Brahma and beg forgiveness and then ask him to please take back all these curses and everything. And he says, well, I won't necessarily take them back, but I'll adjust them so that at least people can continue to function. And again, I can't remember all the specifics of each one of the things, but Daksha, who wound up getting beheaded, was given the head of a goat because that was the curse that Nandi had proclaimed, that because you're just a sense gratifier, the only thing you're expert at is sex life, then you're just like a goat, and I curse you to have the head of a goat. And Brihaspati, I think he said his mustache or something was removed. And the Brahmins, because it was cursing and counter cursing, so the Brahmins would only chant mantras from the Vedas specifically to get money and become like beggars. And the followers of Lord Shiva were cursed to always be, to always be like, in the mode of ignorance, or influenced by the mode of ignorance, all this cursing. So anyway, it took so much to undo this nasty situation, which was fueled by lots of false ego, envy, anger, and revenge. So these three things mean that the whole community was destroyed simply because one person was so proud that he couldn't tolerate the fact someone didn't stand up when he walked into the room, even though the rest of the room was filled with exalted personalities who all stood up. And it's like that sometimes, if there's a white sheet, Prabhupada was saying there's a black spot on the white sheet, all the focus goes to the black spot. And we forget the white sheet. We were discussing the other day that sometimes, even with devotees, we can look at the one thing that's wrong and hone in on that so much that we put the microscope on top of it. Meanwhile, there's like 50 other things that they're doing that's really good. but there's one thing, so it's like this sometimes. We can hone in on that one thing that's the issue. And then it all becomes a problem. So like that. Anyway, the acronym for this pastime is fear, false ego, envy, anger, and revenge. And so this is what led to great upset. And Lord Shiva lost his wife, because of all of this. Community was completely divided. Many people had to suffer different curses and reactions. Just simply because one person was so proud that he couldn't take the humble position. So ultimately the solution to all of this is humility. And we know that there's this verse, Trinadapi Sunichena, Tawarapi Sahishana, Amanina Manadena, Kirtaniya Sadahari. And Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami explains that this verse is so important to a Vaishnava, to a devotee, that he should string this verse on the thread of the holy name and wear it around his neck at all times. So we should always be trying to focus and meditate on this Trinadapi Sunichena Tawarapi Sahishana Amanina Manadena, because then we can Kirtaniya Sadahari. So with this mood we can overcome fear and become abhai. We can become fearless, so we don't have to be afraid if someone disrespects us. We don't have to be afraid that our false ego will be crushed. Anyway, sorry I've gone well over time. Apologies for this. Any reflections, questions? Yes, Gandaki Prabhu.
Yes, we know that everything is under the influence of the three modes of material nature.
Yeah.
So I would like to know if is there anything like anger in the mode of goodness.
Anger in the mode of goodness.
If there is such a thing like anger. Because we know there is a transcendental anger like in Hanuman or Srila Prabhupada.
Yeah, actually, I was just hearing talk the other day about one devotee. I can't remember all the specifics. He didn't speak about anger specifically, but he mentioned how different, especially he was talking about different varnas functioning in different modes and how they would look if they're functioning in different modes. Still acting according to their varna, but more like even mode of ignorance has a goodness aspect to it. There's a, what is it, Prabhupada says, 3 times 3 times 3, it keeps going like that. So it keeps subdividing. So there's kind of a goodness ignorance also. But when you said that, the first thing that I thought of was probably Arjuna fighting on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Now, of course, we would say it's transcendental, but Krishna was trying to incite his anger for the right purpose. And you mentioned Hanuman. Prabhupada says that Hanuman and Arjuna, he gives them both as examples of people who use anger for the right purpose. So, and Prabhupada, in different places, he also explains, of course, here he really stresses on how dangerous anger is, and that we know it's one of the gates to hell. But also, it can be used in Krishna's service. But there's a place where Prabhupada explains that, but we have to be very, very careful. So Hanuman, okay, he was able to use it. Arjuna, he was able to use anger. And of course, Prabhupada says that if someone attacks us, we should just accept. But if someone attacks another devotee, then we should engage that anger. Now, to what extent do we engage that anger? Like, you might have been, I'm not sure if you were at the temple yet, but there was a time one morning at Mangalarti, they had these big protests, marches, and lots of people stayed overnight and got really drunk. And it was early on, it must have been 2002. I don't think I was even initiated yet. And some man walked by, and we had seen him at the protest because we were distributing books. And then he walked by, and we were all chanting before Mangalarti, so it was like 4:15. And we saw him, and we kind of waved. And he was holding a pot plant and a bottle of beer. And then he looked at us, and then he started saying, blah, blah, and just started shouting. And so we all kind of cleared out. And then as he was shouting, I was the last one to go up the steps, and I saw him throw the bottle against the window, and he cracked the window. And I was like, oh my God. Then he went and picked up his metal pipe, and I was thinking, oh my God, he's really going to, and he threw it and smashed the whole window. And I was like, I just became infuriated, and actually I remember things Prabhupada saying, if someone attacks the temple, you just, yeah. So I just like, boom, like fire, just went out the door. And he was running down the street over this pot plant. And like, I just like jumped on his back on the other side of Oxford Street, and he fell to the floor. And I looked back, and there was like 6 brahmacharis who come running over. And I said, just hold him, I'm going to call the police. And then as I was running back towards the temple, I saw that there was a police car coming up. So Oxford Street, so I turned around to flag him down, and when I looked over, there was like 6 brahmacharis pummeling the hell out of this guy on the street. And one of them was like, Padmavati Super, you remember him? He's like, must be 6'5" or something. Like, he looks like Drago from the Rocky movie. And he was just like, boom, and I thought, I don't know if this is proper use of hanging the guy. I mean, he didn't kill anybody, And actually, then the police came, and they wound up, they had to take the guy to the hospital. They took him to the hospital, and then they had to interview, they were going to press charges against the devotees. And it was just like a whole thing, and I was just thinking, well, this wasn't exactly how I pictured it going out. So I had to have several therapy meetings with the temple president to be convinced that sometimes you need to use anger. I still am not convinced that, we have to see how far we go with these things,
You remember when this guy attacked Mahatma in the morning program?
Oh, yeah.
The wall jump on top of people.
Yeah, because he actually went crazy. I remember I brought down the bungee cables, and we had to use for the Sankirtan boxes, and we literally had to bungee him up because he was going freakazoid, like, and devotees called me down. I came down. There's like 3 devotees sitting on top of him. And And I brought down bungee cables and we bungeed him up and kind of almost like hog tied him. And then the police came and they came up and they saw it and they were like, okay. And then he said, okay, you can let him up, we're here. And we let him up and he went, I have no idea what these crazy people are doing. I did not, he was like, I did nothing. I was like, you did nothing, the guy was insane. And then he said, how dare you speak? And he, all of a sudden he was like the most composed, normal person. And like, 15 minutes before that, he was like lunging at body. He was going to break, I think, Prabhupada deity. He was going towards the Murti, and he was just mad. So they took him outside and talked with him. And again, they kind of, anyways, we're discussing all kinds of crazy stuff. This is going out on television or out on the internet. Yeah, what's happening?
I just know Krishna says there's inaction. So there's no reaction. It's like, I hate what Prabhupada said, because they were talking about Gandhi and non-violence, and somebody was, I think it was raping a woman, which was just standing there and doing nothing to them. And he said, well, that means you're a rascal, because by your inaction, you'll get more of a reaction than if you behave with anger. In other words, if you get angry, it's completely justified. Then you protect the woman's purity, and then maybe the person gets a little bit damaged, but there's no action.
Reaction.
Yeah. So inaction, nothing.
Yeah. Inaction and action, and action and inaction.
Yeah, so I think to answer your question, anger can be used in service and can be justified, even let's say in the mode of goodness, like in that situation. They might not be protecting some lady who's being attacked for the purpose of, for Krishna's service or because she's a devotee, but they're doing the right thing, But it's easy. I think the point is that with anger, it's very easy. It can quickly degrade into something else. They say sometimes Srila Prabhupada would get angry. Devotees would be sitting there, and then he would like slam his hand on the table or his fist and say, "No! Why do you say like that? That is incorrect." And then he would just turn to the next devotee and go, "So how are things in Chicago?" Because he would use it to exhibit that I'm not happy, you've displeased the spiritual master, you should do it a different way. But he wasn't attached to like the whole thing, and he didn't get off, worked up and have to leave the room and do 10 breaths or do something. He would just move on to the next devotee and be like, okay, so how are things going in Chicago? How is this? What happened in New York? How many books were distributed yesterday?
And just to comment, at the end of the Bhagavatam, it seems quite scary, because it says, the reaction for offending a Vaishnava is that he may perform any abominable action. So then it seems that the reaction is potentially even more detrimental, and that there is a cumulative, that once you set this in motion, already it's like you would think, oh, maybe the reaction would in some way impair him doing any more, but it seems that the reaction is now he's going to really dig himself, and he's just going to get worse and worse from some small thing. Suddenly it's going to really, and that's what the pastime shows, isn't it? Just from a little thing going wrong, and suddenly the whole thing's really.
So many people wind up suffering and so many things.
Yeah, very good point. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so from Vaishnava Aparad, it creates a domino effect or a chain reaction of things perpetuating and even getting worse, much worse, until somehow it all comes to a head where someone loses their head.
Yeah, what's even worse is everyone gets, everyone's to blame, It's like, rather than anyone taking the position to extricate themselves from the situation, suddenly everyone's implicated. So it's one person's wrong, and then suddenly
everyone gets the reaction for it. Yeah. This is like
Example. Yeah. Somehow someone gets something on them, and then everybody gets covered in it like coal dust,
It's interesting in that verse, Prabhupada says that the person that derives is directly disobeying. So somebody may make a fault, but even worse than the fault is the person that derives the fault, so the reaction is even worse.
Yeah. So
Point being that if someone makes a mistake and they try to rectify themselves, then they're to be considered saintly. But if we criticize them because they made some mistake and we hold on to that, then that's, you're saying, he says, it's even worse. Then you get a reaction for that. So that's also that. Yeah, it was a very big topic. So we've gone quite a bit over time. Sorry about that. So maybe conclude here. That's okay. Well, kind attention and encouragement. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Entourage Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Nitai Gaur Premanandi.
Jai.